Weren't you already fired for saying something dumb?
Haven't you been bleeding enough subscribers over the past couple of months for saying things so dumb and ignorant? Everyone been coming down on Megyn Kelly the past couple of days since her podcast earlier this week, where she had a guest on who was at the Capital Riots on January the 6th. They have been so far off base, the amazing Lucas, no different, who in recent months has decided to grift so hard against the right conservatives, to which he had been tap dancing for the better part of Trump's campaign or Trump's term until he was out of office, then switched up, that they've been so blinded in their bias and or attempts to attack those who happen to fall on the right or conservative, that they are willing to half-ass a report and or a situation. And I'm going to play the whole context. So Megyn Kelly had a guest on back on Tuesday, and they discussed the Capitol riots and the media's portrayal of it. And what the mainstream media did, and Lucas was no different, is take out of context, out of a whole conversation, a conversation that lasted about a little over an hour, but a specific point in the conversation that lasted anywhere from 5 to 6 minutes. They took a few seconds of that conversation and ran with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the majority of that conversation. I'll play the 3 minutes of it that will allow you to have the full context of what was actually said and discussed, and then you'll see just how foolish a lot of those individuals will then look coming down on her, or at least you'll be able to see the bias, and then I'll give my 2 cents after it. So let's go ahead and listen to the full clip of the conversation that Megyn Kelly had in terms of media representation. Let's go.
And it just bothers me because I was there, and anybody who was there on the 6th is like blown away with how inaccurate the media coverage is. It's like, at this point, it's like, I don't want to listen to anybody's thoughts on the 6th unless they were like there, like physically there, because for a group of people who could have come fully armed to the Capitol, they didn't. It was extremely peaceful and chill. And most of us didn't even know what was happening until like hours later, until like 4 or 5 o'clock when we were leaving. Hilarious costumes.
But a faction turned, and there's no question the media represented this as so much worse than it actually was. But we've all seen the video of people like screaming in the face of cops, being totally disparaging, and defecating on the floor of the U.S. Capitol.
That's crazy.
Lawmakers were understandably afraid. Not like AOC, I need therapy for the rest of my life, afraid, but I could understand it, and I didn't like seeing it at all. That's our Capitol. Get the hell out of there. Have some respect. Don't threaten the cops. Screw you. The MAGA crowd is supposed to be pro-cop, and you don't get in their faces and yell at them and say that, all this shitty stuff, which I heard, with my own ears.
That's crazy. That I didn't see any of that. Yeah.
That doesn't mean that's what the entire crowd was there for, intended to do. So they got tarred by the actions of like some losers who went a different way. And then the media did what it does, which is any bad behavior gets attributed to the entire group of Trump supporters, not just on the Capitol, but in the country. Right. Remember? After that, it was like, you're a MAGA supporter, you're a Trump supporter, you're on the banned list. Here's what I wanted to get your reaction to. Matthew Dowd, who is one of the biggest losers on Twitter, and that's saying something. He's on with Joy Reid all the time, and he's like a Nicole Wallace type. And here he was just the other day on with Joy Reid talking about the impact of the Capitol riot. Listen to him.
To me, though there was less loss of life on January 6th, January 6th was worse than 9/11 because it's continued to rip our country apart and give permission for people to pursue autocratic means. And so I think we're at a much worse place than we've been. And as I've said, I think to you before, I think we're in the most perilous point in time since 1861 in the advent of the Civil War.
I do too.
Well, you're a couple of idiots.
What a moron.
Yeah, it's like that.
They're intimidated and so threatened that like the American people are taking back their voice and like being heard. And I think they're just upset, like, oh, all the censorship. Yeah, it's still not enough. People are still gonna let their voices be heard.
Was worse than 9/11.
Wow.
3,000 people died. Firefighters, cops, children who were on those planes that got turned into bombs, into missiles, who must have been terrified for their lives as they went into those buildings.
Me too.
It's infuriating. And Joy Reid too. It's infuriating. It's so disrespectful to the Americans who lost their lives, who were forced to jump from the 90th floor. Having to choose between being burned to death by jet fuel and jumping to their deaths. It makes me so angry. That kind of talk, fine, right? Like somehow he's considered a patriotic American.
So you heard the whole clip there of what was being discussed in that context of the conversation that the mainstream media and a lot of those on the left intentionally left out, and or individuals like Amazing Lucas just half-assed their research into what was actually discussed. And that was Megyn Kelly criticizing those in the media. More specifically, she played a clip from Chris Dow and Joy Reid literally saying that the Capitol riots back on January the 6th were worse than the events of 9/11. Even Pearl Harbor, I believe in that clip, they said that we hadn't seen anything like this, that dire in this country since just before the Civil War in 1861. So that includes Pearl Harbor, and more specifically, they called out 9/11. That was her argument, that they were saying that the Capitol riots was above, here's 9/11, Pearl Harbor, so Pearl Harbor, 9/11, Capitol riots. That's the argument that the media has been making. That's what Megyn Kelly was attacking specifically, claiming that the riots were worse than 9/11. Think about that now for a moment. 9/11, over 3,000 people killed, about 1,000 people on the planes alone, men, women, and children who were turned into human missiles as they plunged into the Twin Towers. Not to mention that one plane that fell in, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, on the western side of the state of PA. And those individuals who courageously fought off the terrorists who hijacked the plane to stop it from going to DC and force the plane to crash land in PA. Worse than individuals who had to decide whether or not they were going to jump off of the 90th floor of the World Trade Center to their certain deaths, or burned to death. Worse than individuals who were trapped under rubble or bodies that were trapped under rubble for weeks, if not months. Individuals, family members who did not know whether or not if their loved ones survived or not for weeks or months until parts of the bodies were recovered. Thousands of individuals, mostly first responders who were there in the scene of 9/11, who have since then suffered numerous, if not cancerous, injuries and or illnesses as a result of the toxic fumes in the air. And just regular individuals who were in the vicinity, lived and or commuted in or worked, breathing in toxic air that was in the area, and the lifelong lingering effects of that. They're saying that the Capitol riot, which caused almost very little to no major property damage at all, maybe 100 or so injuries, and 5 deaths related to it, with only 1 death actually occurring that day, and it wasn't even by any of the protesters, but rather it was Ashley Babbitt, who was killed by a cop who was on the other side of a door, shooting blindly at her. That was worse than the destruction of 2 of the most iconic buildings in the world. That led to, again, thousands of deaths, thousands of lingering injuries. That was worse. That's the argument that Megyn Kelly was making. And so everyone who's coming down on her is saying that she was wrong. This was, in fact, worse than 9/11, worse than Pearl Harbor, and just about as bad as the American Civil War. Now, my biggest criticism, too, of people like the Amazing Lucas, for instance, they are intentionally half-assing what was actually being said on Megyn Kelly's podcast. They didn't even bother to listen, or I think in his case, I think the media intentionally took just a few seconds of clips and said this was the whole conversation that she was making, that she was just saying nothing about the comparisons to 9/11. They are whitewashing that as if she never discussed it. They're saying she says that the events of January the 6th at the Capitol riots were nothing. It was a walk in the park. Anyone who says otherwise, they're hyping it up. That's the argument that they were trying to make by intentionally just taking a few seconds of a clip and including that with the comedian who she was interviewing, Chrissie Mayr, if I'm not mistaken, who was actually there, confusing it, twisting it up as if it was just a nothing event. That's the falsehood that they were trying to portray, and that's what the amazing Lucas ran off. Take a look at this clip that he did on his video.
Brings us to Megyn Blackface Kelly. Megyn Kelly is on her podcast. She goes out and says, you know what? The media is just, they overblew this thing, okay? They took this made it way worse than what it was, okay?
The faction turned, and there's no question the media represented this as so much worse than it actually was. But, you know, we've all seen the video of people like screaming in the face of cops, being totally disparaging and, you know, defecating on the floor of the U.S. Capitol.
That's crazy. I mean, it's horrible. Like Ashley Babbitt was murdered. Should not have happened. But like for a group of people who could have come fully armed to the Capitol, they didn't. It was extremely peaceful and chill. And most of us didn't even know what was happening until like hours later.
So you saw he played the same few second clips that twisted the context of the conversation that was being had, where you started off with Megyn Kelly acknowledging there were some bad actors there, but then still saying that the media overhyped it, followed by Chrissie, who conversation was actually before Megyn Kelly's, where Chrissie Mayr said that, I don't recall there being nothing to the Capitol. That was a completely different part of the conversation, as you heard in the whole clip, because Chrissie started off the conversation with that comment of saying, from her perspective, having been there on the ground herself, it was really not a big deal. The event itself, there really wasn't that much to it. It was a huge turnout, by the way. Easily around 350,000 to 500,000 easily in the ballpark, maybe even more people there. So it was a massive event, massive turnout, but from what she saw, there was nothing major going on. It wasn't people there going to overthrow the government, at least not by and large. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the people who were there didn't even know what was happening until hours later when they hear the reports, because a lot of them wound up just going on to their own thing afterwards. While there was a planned event to march to the Capitol, I don't think a number of people really even got there. In fact, what was going on at the Capitol, the invasion of it, did occur started during President Trump's speech. So by the time Trump was over, or by the time a number of people started to leave to head down to the Capitol, it had already started, and they didn't even see a lot of the chaos. But that was the way that they misconstrued Megyn Kelly's argument. In that video, Lucas then shows some of the violence that took place there, as some, again, keyword being some of those protesters tried to force their way past certain barricades that the police were having to justify the argument that, no, this was actually pretty bad. That's not the conversation Megyn Kelly was having. She was not saying there weren't any individuals that went rogue and did a lot of things they shouldn't have. In fact, she even said as much. He played just a small clip of her acknowledging that, and that was bad. No, what they were saying is that this was not as bad as 9/11, which is the claim that the media was making. Many in the media were saying that this was not as bad as 9/11. They were saying that this is worse. They weren't saying that this was a nothing event overall. Now, the conversation that Chrissie Mayr had earlier in regards to it being not a big deal was from her perspective, as one of the overwhelming majority of that near 500,000 individuals that were there didn't even know what was going on at the Capitol. They weren't a part of it. That was not the majority of what happened that day. And Megyn Kelly made a separate argument to that comment, stating that the media was trying to whitewash everyone who was there as being part of an overthrow or an attack on democracy, when that wasn't the case. There was this big whitewash, which she is correct. That's what a lot of the media were doing, whereas the majority of people who were there were not there to enter into the Capitol building, weren't there to literally stop the vote. They were just there to voice their concerns about what was going on in the election. And no, as the amazing Lucas said, it wasn't a matter as simple as our guy lost, but rather these individuals had legitimate claims to there being impropriety to what was happening, and that there was no attempt to investigate, because by that point there was only one full forensic audit done, and that was in Antrim County, Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, in which case they had to literally overturn the results in that particular county. But then that was it. There was no other big audits completed, despite the fact that you had hundreds, if not 1,000 individuals coming forward with sworn affidavits to improprieties that, again, were never really looked into. Even to this day, the Maricopa County in Arizona audit just got completed, in which case they found major improprieties there. And then one was actually also just right now, July the 16th, 2021, was just released to show also thousands of duplicate votes scanned, or votes scanned twice in Fulton County, Georgia. So there was no attempt to look at it, just sweep it under the rug, and that's what they were voicing their opinion on and thoughts. So for all those coming down on Megyn Kelly and her saying that those in the media who she specifically called out, like Joy Reid, for comparing what happened on January the 6th as being worse than 9/11, you are siding with that argument that it was in fact worse than over 3,000 people dying, losing their lives, the destruction of two iconic buildings, the Twin Towers, millions of individual lives affected as a result of the loss of their loved ones, thousands of others whose health were permanently complicated from breathing in toxic air and or chemicals down from the financial district down there, including the first responders. You're saying that that was not as bad as what happened on January the 6th. And if you didn't realize it, again, that was because that was coming from an ignorant point, because you just went with the manipulated few second clips that the media showed, as opposed to the whole conversation and what Megyn Kelly was specifically referring to, because she did in fact come down on those who participated in what happened at the Capitol, at least those who had the worst part of it, because let's not forget about this clip here.
Police are squabbling with protesters. Oh, there we go. And they just breached the Capitol again. Fucking traitors! They're gonna lock us in.
You can disagree with it, but respect it.
So yes, what you just saw there were people being let in. They were not forcing that group of individuals, because there were multiple ways of getting into the Capitol. What Lucas and some of the media wanted to focus on were the worst elements that happened very early during the, I guess, what you can say, invasion of the Capitol. But there was another side where they were not at all fighting with police officers. The police just let them in. They just let them in. There was no scuffle, no fight. Those individuals on that side of the building did nothing wrong. The cops just let them in. Not to mention all of the selfies we have of individuals who were in there taking selfies with cops. They were not there fighting against or injuring anyone. So there were two different groups, even at the Capitol, displaying two different things. And then, if I'm not mistaken, the founder of the Walk Away movement, from his perspective, along with others, is those who were at the Trump speech who tried to head over to the Capitol, maybe not right after the end of Trump's speech, but shortly before, because they realized, oh, it's starting to get late and it's extremely cold, let's go to the next thing. By the time they even got there, individuals had already breached the Capitol. They did not know what it took for them to get in there. They just saw people going in, the doors were already open, people were filing in. So they had nothing to do with what happened prior to that. They weren't causing, those individuals were not causing destruction. So I would say, again, a lot in the left, and even the Amazing Lucas, what they did is they whitewashed the entire event, and then trying to say, well, the right all of a sudden discovered nuance. it's not that they discovered nuance so much, but rather they're not only playing the same thing that the left and the media in terms of propaganda were playing, because you had many in the media literally trying to pretend as though there was no violence, no destruction, and there was actually individuals on the left who were not only justifying the violence that was transpiring, but then also rewarding those by bailing them out. We have even politicians saying we need getting together to raise bail money, and then those who were causing the destruction and were getting arrested were getting released within hours and or days of what transpired, with no follow-up court date or just a slap on the wrist. Therefore, saying this is okay behavior. So not only were they trying to make it look like the violence never took place, but what violence was taking place by the 7% was being rewarded and or protected. And so that was bad. That was a bad look. Yes, you had some Republicans who only focused on the destruction, but then again, that's a good thing to focus on. Unlike myself, I gave props to those who were out there in the BLM riots over the summer who tried to stop those, and also calling out those individuals, like that one guy who might have been with Antifa, or he might have been an undercover cop plant with an umbrella just smashing windows, and was actually confronted by some BLM protesters. One guy famously was smoking a joint at the time with pizza in hand, decided to put the joint down, had someone hold his pizza box while he went and confronted the guy with the umbrella and hammer, just knocking out windows. Individuals who were actually being impartial did call that out, say, there were definitely some plants involved. There weren't, not everyone involved were taking place in a foolery. But again, it's not nuanced to say that there was a small segment of both movements that made more destructive actions that tarnished the events as a whole, and it wasn't enough to stop it. But with the January 6th, out of the 350 to 500,000 people, if they really wanted to cause an insurrection, there wouldn't have been nothing that the cops and they would have definitely had to send in the National Guard from Virginia, and even that might not have been enough. They might have needed to send in the National Guards from Maryland as well. Whether or not that would have been enough, again, because 500,000 people, if they really wanted an insurrection, there really would have been some major property damage, not just 5 people dead as a result of the incident, or at least connected to the incident, but rather there would have been dozens, if not 100 people killed had there truly been an insurrection. It really was the actions of less than maybe 1% of the total crowd there, maybe less than half of 1%, who were more aggressive, and then everyone else was just following in and or just there to raise a voice. But that's all, again. So for those who were coming down on Megyn Kelly, it was out of ignorance and or propaganda to twist her conversation and what was actually being discussed, in terms of not realizing that the media was trying to peg this as being worse than 9/11. Let that sink in. And to the Mason Lucas and his fan who have still stuck with him, although he's been, like I said, bleeding subscribers for the past several months. This man was over 500,000 subs back when he was grifting more so to the left, while still grifting to the right, while still placating as though he was independent and down the middle. Now shifted so far right that he, so far left, he's like, yeah, I'm losing to people like Brandon Tatum, ABL, and Young Ripper, aka Eric July. So I can no longer compete in that lane. Let me try to go back to the center left and then just script hard on them, especially with the change in guard in the White House. Biden's in the White House now. So I'll more or less side with them and attack their enemies. That's where he's gone, and he's just been bleeding. In fact, I did a video on the downfall of the amazing Lucas. And at that time, just a couple of weeks ago on my previous channel, the dude had about, 404,000 subs. And now it looks like he's down another 11,000 to 393,000 and bleeding fast, because he doesn't realize just how hard he grifted to the left and intentionally trying to burn bridges with his previous audience. I don't know why, but it was a very ignorant statement to do, and that comment on Megyn Kelly just proved the point that he's just trying to go so hard against the right and conservatives for whatever reason. Again, I think it was just grifting season and a change in the guard in the White House, so he changed with, the presidents. all right, and didn't fully research or look into her actual podcast and what was being said. So that's my video. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to my new channel here. But this is Bruce the Boss Resurrected, and I'm out. Peace.